Thanks very much, Dr. Sanders. It's a pleasure to be with you today. It's particularly an honor and privilege to facilitate a conversation with Ambassador Ryan Crocker. Let me just add to Ron's formal introduction. Ambassador Crocker is known as probably one of the most distinguished and accomplished American diplomats of his generation. So he's honed his diplomatic expertise in the School of Hard Knocks. Years before some secretaries of state started talking about having an expeditionary type force of a diplomatic corps, Ambassador Crocker was in Lebanon dodging bombs by Hezbollah. So he's had a remarkable career with 6 ambassadorships. He's served ably in both Democratic and Republican administrations in the noblest sense, the best sense of an apolitical foreign service that we're privileged to have in this country. So we've got a number of things. Mr. Ambassador, I want to welcome you to our session this afternoon. I know it's been exceptionally trying and difficult times for you professionally and probably personally, and enormous amount of tasks or requests for sharing of your expertise, which is really irreplaceable. So thank you for joining us. Mr. Ambassador, what I'd like to do today is a couple of things, kind of put myself in the position of our viewing audience. If we were in had a live audience, the types of questions that they'd be asking you, trying to pick your brains and your expertise to help navigate, where we've been the past 20 years and where we're going into the future. And so we'll be talking about, events in and around Afghanistan, to be sure. We'll broaden the scope of the conversation to talk about regional realities in the Middle East and South Asia and implications for great power competition, which we're looking at more and more these days and is a focus of this conference in the aftermath of 9/11. And then we'll talk about the Foreign Service, which is a key instrument of American power in the world. It's one that is often neglected, and yet, it'd be important to hear your thoughts and your assessment of what we need to go further in the future with the U.S. Diplomatic Corps and our Department of State. So, Mr. Ambassador, let me kick off talking about when we're looking in and around Afghanistan. Might you share your reflections? 20 years, out. You look in the rearview mirror, if you will. And look at events around 9/11. What brought us to the events of 9/11 and subsequent years? What does it look like from your perspective?
9/11 for folks of our generation, it's like for an older generation, where were you when President Kennedy was assassinated? All of us, I think, remember every minute of that day once we heard the news. I was on a U.S. Air shuttle flight from D.C. up to LaGuardia, actually going up to talk to the Russian Perm Rep, Sergei Lavrov, not about Afghanistan, but about Iraq. That was my portfolio at the time in state. We made our descent over Manhattan, and we could see smoke coming out of the first tower. And we're scratching our heads. What could that possibly be? How could a plane fly into the World Trade Center on a brilliant blue September morning? Just as we touched down, the second tower was hit, and we had our answer. It was a deliberate attack. I tried to get to the UN headquarters. Nonetheless, taxi was stuck on the Queensboro Bridge, and it was from that bridge that I could see the 2 towers go down. Needed to get back to Washington. Obviously, wasn't going to fly there or take a train, so I rented a car. And on that long drive back, I started trying to put the pieces together. Just a day or so before 9/11, we'd had the interesting incident of Ahmed Shah Massoud, the commander of the Northern Alliance, so-called, that had been able to prevent the Taliban from taking the whole country. They had hung on in the Northeast. And he had been assassinated by a couple of suicide bombers posing as a television crew. And when it happened, I wondered, well, why on earth would anybody do that? And now I had my answer. And it was also, of course, the answer to who exactly did this, that it was Al-Qaeda, and they wanted to take Ahmed Shah Massoud off the field as the most capable opposition military commander there in Afghanistan. And then the other reflection I had was, you know, this is going to really change my life. I don't know how, but it's really going to change my life. And so it did. So it did for all of us.
And what was it? What was the difference between your career, before 9/11 and then after? I mean, how did the profession change? How did the demands change in national security writ large and diplomacy in particular?
9/11 catapulted the entire nation into a different dimension, and indeed the world itself. It was a time at one of those hinge points in history. What is the world going to look like going forward, and how is that world going to be shaped? And I saw that at the time. I think I felt right from the beginning that the United States would lead in the response to 9/11. We were the initial target after all. And in that sense, it would be consistent with how the US had led in a new world order, really ever since World War II. It was almost a given that this would be something that we would try to get our arms around in a way that made clear our leadership role globally. How that would play out, I just didn't know. And it's put together piecemeal. I'll give you one example. Just as we restarted civil aviation in this country, I was on one of the first flights out of Dulles heading east in mid-September, heading for Geneva. Geneva, because that's where the European headquarters of the United Nations was. And it was where something called the Geneva Group met. The Geneva Group was the United States, Iran, Germany, and Italy. It had been put together several years before. I wasn't even aware of it. The Foreign Service is pretty tribal. So I was part of the Near East tribe that whose writ and mandate ended at the Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan border. We included Iran. Pakistan and Afghanistan were part of the South Asia Bureau. So I didn't even know about this mechanism. But after 9/11, given the Iranian position on the Taliban, which was to consider it an existential threat to Iran, suddenly we had something to talk about with the Iranians. So that in the opening days, that was already making my life a little bit different as the Near East Bureau kind of took hold of that Geneva process because it gave us a mechanism to talk to the Iranians.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to ask you, talked about a hinge movement, 9/11 being a hinge moment in American national security history, much like I imagine the fall of the Berlin Wall was a hinge movement. If I fast forward to today, how do you see events in Afghanistan with the withdrawal, the Biden administration's withdrawal? Are we looking at, in your view, another hinge event in American national security?
Well, that's a great way to frame it up, Rick. I fear that we are at another hinge moment, and one of our own creating. That the president's decision to withdraw us completely from Afghanistan on a pretty short timetable set in motion, of course, the chain of negative events that we're wrestling with right now. What it was not, that decision, and then of course it's very badly handled execution. Well, that's not leadership, that's retreat. And in an ever more polarized, unstable, and frankly dangerous world, the notion of an American retreat, almost literally under fire, is precisely the signal we would not want to send to the world. Now that, in my own mind, has been mitigated just a bit by the intensive diplomatic efforts that the Biden administration has had underway. Secretary Blinken joined on many occasions by the Secretary of Defense, has been engaged, has been blanketing the world, and particularly the Middle East. The Saudis, the Emiratis, Qataris, the Kuwaitis, the two secretaries have been almost literally everywhere. That speaks of leadership. Now, we'll have to see where it goes. But after some weeks now of really dispiriting news of an administration that seemed to be backing away, retreating from the world, giving the battle space in Afghanistan to a nemesis of ours, the Taliban, not only inconsistent, I think, with our sense of what America is as a leader, highly, highly dangerous, I think, to a world that is not going to run itself, at least not in any way that we would want to experience.
Mr. Ambassador, I just can't help but I want to ask you if you see any similarities or lessons to be learned from, as you say, the retreat under fire perception in Afghanistan with your earlier years in Lebanon. When the Reagan administration pulled out of Lebanon, was there not also a perception that we were retreating under fire? Or is this a good analogy, or are they very different in your view?
Well, I think it's a great analogy, actually, because I experienced it. I spent 3 years as political counselor at the embassy in Lebanon, 1981 to 84, in which a lot of momentous things happened, none of them good. We had Marines deployed to support the safe evacuation of Palestine Liberation Organization fighters in the summer of 1982. That we would cover in particular the port area of Beirut because they were departing by ship. And our presence was the insurance they demanded to get out of the country, but not be attacked by Israel, which was in occupation of most of Lebanon from Beirut south. That was it was a narrow, finite mission that they accomplished with no difficulties and no losses, and were themselves then immediately withdrawn. And then there was the assassination of the president-elect of Lebanon, Bashir Jamal, which the Israelis used as a trigger to do what they had always wanted to do, which was invade West Beirut itself, the predominantly Muslim part of Beirut, and also where the PLO is headquartered. They didn't come alone. They brought a Lebanese Christian militia with them, the Lebanese forces. That militia then conducted operations in mid-September of 1982 in the Shatila refugee camp. Those operations were a massacre. Men, women, children. As events turned, I was the first American into that camp, not knowing there had been a massacre, just knowing that something unusual was going on. And I reported back to the embassy, and the embassy back to Washington, and Washington to the world, that there had been a massacre in the Shatila camp. Why did this matter? Again, we had given assurances to the PLO as part of the agreement for their departure that we would guarantee the safety of Palestinian civilians left behind. Well, those horrific images I saw in that camp were not exactly consistent with guaranteeing the safety of civilians. So in that crisis moment, the decision was taken to send the Marines back to Beirut, but without a clearly defined mission and with no clear timetable as to how long they would be there. Fast forward, the Marines are on the worst possible ground they could be on, hemmed in by the sea behind them and the mountains in front of them. Opponents and enemies had the high ground, we didn't. And as time went on, the pace of efforts to harass the Marines with fire picked up and picked up and picked up. not just the Marines. In April 1983, the embassy was bombed. I was in it, a survivor, obviously. And then 6 months later, the Marines themselves were bombed. Their barracks there at the airport. October 1983 was the loss of some 245 Marines. And that takes us up to the point you just mentioned, that the decision by the president to withdraw the Marines. He really didn't have many options at that point. The options existed before. The administration did not choose the right ones, in my view. But the lesson that taught to our adversaries, primarily Syria and Iran, who had organized the bombing, was that if you make the Americans bleed, they will go. You can outlast them. You cannot expect to defeat them when they come in force, but you can definitely outlast them. And that narrative, if you will, was present in the Middle East from really from 1983 on forward. That it was exactly what I saw a quarter of a century later when I arrived as the new ambassador to Iraq. I felt like I was stepping off a helicopter, not in Baghdad, but in Beirut 25 years earlier, because the same dynamic was in play, brought to us by the same two adversaries, the Syrians in the West, using al-Qaeda fighters and leaders who would transit through Damascus into Iraq to harass us on the West. The Iranians doing pretty much the same thing to the East, again, using proxies. They were good at it. They invented Hezbollah in Lebanon. They were doing the same thing in Iraq. And that was why, with General Petraeus, it was so important that we made it clear that our presence in Iraq was strategic. It involved our national security. And we would not be bound by timetables or by anything else except conditions on the ground as we perceived them. And we were successful, actually, in delivering that message at the testimony before Congress in September of 2007, which bridged, incidentally, both the anniversary of 9/11, but also the anniversary of the Shatila massacre on September 18, 1983. So that was what we were trying to offset, that we would be bound by conditions. Don't think you can outlast us. You can't. And that is what adds, I think, such weight to what has happened in Afghanistan. Actually, yes, you can outlast us. We will get tired of it. We will just want to go on to something else. Not that we were defeated, except to the extent we defeated ourselves, that we were moving on to other stuff. And then, of course, the calamitous way in which the collapse came underscores the new Taliban narrative that clad only in the armor of the one true faith, this band of lightly armed soldiers of God defeated the great infidel. That is going to make the world a more dangerous place, certainly for America, in the years and decades to come, unless we take some corrective action.
Mr. Ambassador, just being an academic and having an outsider's view, but it does seem to be that we had remarkable staying power, actually. The counter argument would be, 2003 to 2011 in Iraq, I mean, that's large standing power. 20 years in Afghanistan. If you had told me in October of 2001 that we'd be in Afghanistan 20 years later, I would have said you're completely out of your mind. I mean, so that has been a remarkable, remarkably long military commitment. Now, what would you say? What would be the argument to those that say that, look, the President Biden actually did what other presidents had wanted to do, but weren't willing to take to bleed the political capital, frankly. So in other words, you had President Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan. President Obama, as you know well, wanted to get out of Afghanistan, but that Biden actually took the political hits to make that decision, and there are legitimate other interest in, particularly when you talk about great power competitions in Asia and Europe. I mean, what do you say to that type of argument?
Well, that is completely misguided. And again, to the extent that people actually believe it, therefore highly dangerous. Look, I had the privilege of being in Afghanistan at various times. My first trip there was just after New Year's Day, 2002. I formally reopened our embassy. And as I kind of got my bearings on in the landscape, particularly on the issue of where our forces were, we really had only one conventional ground unit. That was the battalion landing team from a Marine Expeditionary Unit, configured, I think, with about 5,000 Marines in total. That was it. And then I watched the parabola form and develop. I came back as ambassador in 2011, and at that time, just about the peak of the Afghan troop surge, we were up to 100,000 troops. And then against what? Well, to ensure that the Taliban basically could not take and hold ground worth taking and holding in Afghanistan. And they didn't. Of Afghanistan's 34 provinces, the Taliban controlled not a single provincial capital. And then we started the drawdown, again, envisioned in the surge itself. So that by the end of the Obama administration, we had just a little over 10,000 US troops on the ground, an equal number of NATO forces. And the Taliban did not occupy or hold a single provincial capital. That number went down and down to 5,000 late in the Trump presidency. And then he cut it further down to 2,500. And the Taliban still controlled no Afghan provincial capitals. So, we were maintaining a strategic position with an ever smaller force. And I would argue at the time that this was a pretty cheap insurance policy against, again, a Taliban takeover of the country. Unlike every other place where we are worried about terrorist threats that could include attacks on the homeland, in Afghanistan, it wasn't theoretical. I mean, it had happened. And we need to remember that the Taliban had a choice after 9/11. We told them that they could hand over the al-Qaeda leadership and we would leave them alone. They chose exile, and that exile lasted for 20 years. They never broke their links with al-Qaeda. So we had every reason to assume that if the Taliban were back in control, al-Qaeda would be right there with them. And we've already seen that now with the highly publicized return to Jalalabad of the individual who was responsible for security when Osama bin Laden was present in Afghanistan. So again, it's not theoretical. The Taliban al-Qaeda connection that brought us 9/11 is now back. When we could have kept it at bay, really, with this minimal force commitment, and to say we've got to pay attention to other places in the world. Look, 2,500 troops or 5,000 troops in Afghanistan does not exactly break the military. We actually would still have a few soldiers, sailors, Marine and airmen that could deal with other contingencies and other threats elsewhere. So again, we basically defeated ourselves in Afghanistan, giving ground back to the Taliban. But not only that, giving them this tremendous narrative of vanquishing the United States military all by themselves. So we're going to see, sadly, a resurgence of support for radical Islamic movements around the world. Frankly, you're certainly going to see it next door in Pakistan. So it was an own goal, as soccer founder saying, the Taliban didn't defeat us in Afghanistan, but they get to put that into their narrative. We effectively defeated ourselves.
Mr. Ambassador, might you say a word about your assessment of the reasons why the Afghan military security forces and the entire government actually collapsed, instantaneously collapsed? I can't help but think it's similarly or reminiscent of the collapse we saw in the Iraqi military when you had a procession of lightly armed, as you say, lightly equipped, lightly armed ISIS fighters come across the border from Syria into Iraq. We had the collapse of major Iraqi military divisions. But did you anticipate such a quick and rapid abandonment of positions and exile, international exile by the leadership?
There were at least two significant differences from Iraq. One of them was that in Iraq, we pulled out the last of our deployed forces at the end of 2011. Islamic State did not surge across Western Iraq until the summer of 2014. So we would at least have the defense of saying we weren't there. We were not engaged. We did not have visibility on the state of Iraqi armed forces. In Afghanistan, of course, it was simultaneous. 1 week we were there as advisors, and the next week we were gone. So we must have had visibility on the state of readiness and morale on the part of Afghan security forces. A second critical difference is we ourselves bear a huge responsibility for the demoralization and eventual collapse of those security forces. And it dates back to President Trump and his decision that we would engage in negotiations about our presence and our eventual troop withdrawal directly with the Taliban without the Afghan government represented. A long-standing Taliban demand. They would say, we'll talk to you, but we're not going to talk to your puppet. And we gave in. That was a huge step in delegitimizing the Afghan government and demoralizing the security forces that kept that government in place. And it didn't get better. At one point, still during the Trump administration, as a necessity in the view of that administration, we forced the government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners who immediately joined the fight against that government and against the Afghan National Security Forces. Well, it doesn't take a whole lot to imagine how that went down with Afghan troopers and their commanders. That the United States, which we had and they had assumed was there to guarantee that the Taliban would not be coming back, has basically switched sides and forced the government into steps that directly resulted in the death and wounding of countless more Afghan troopers. Kind of hard to stay in the fight when your ally is overtly assisting your enemy and then forcing you to assist your own enemy because you haven't got anywhere else to turn. So I don't find it too surprising at all that the structure collapsed once we made it clear we were gone. All of this will have to come out. It is a tale yet to be told. We are going to have countless congressional hearings on it. But the broad outline was we effectively not only defeated ourselves by leaving the battlefield, we guaranteed the collapse and defeat of Afghan National Security Forces through a progressive process, again, of demoralizing them, delegitimizing them. I didn't think anything could make the Paris peace talks in the 70s about our departure from Vietnam look good, but this process did. And it is at the feet of not one president, but two, one Republican, one Democrat.
Mr. Ambassador, you alluded to the influence of the Al-Qaeda network in the government that's taking shape in Kabul. Could you, given your former position as ambassador to Pakistan, looking ahead, how is the United States going to best position itself diplomatically in working with or even against Pakistan. I mean, how do you? That's always been the hard nut in the Afghanistan equation. Pakistan's constant support for Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda and the Taliban.
Yes. So I spent 3 years as ambassador to Pakistan, 2004, 2007, and came to hear the Pakistani narrative on the Taliban and indeed on Al-Qaeda, so that I could almost quote it from memory. And I'll give you the short version just now. So the Pakistanis would recall the decade of the 1980s, how after the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan, we and they entered into a strategic collaboration to drive the Soviets out. This was done by training Afghan fighters in the northwest frontier of Pakistan, arming them, supplying them, making them a highly capable infantry force against the Soviets. And it worked. The Soviets retreated in defeat at the end of the 1980s, and that moment was the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, as a matter of fact. We had prevailed. So the Bush 41 administration said, look, our work here is done. We've defeated our strategic enemy. What comes next is not our business. Well, what was coming next was an Afghan civil war. Very clear to see that the Mujahideen factions without a common enemy, which is the Soviet Union, would turn on each other. And that's what they did in a truly murderous fashion. The death toll and the toll of destruction that made Kabul look like Berlin 1945 was done by the Afghans to the Afghans. But we did more. We also stopped getting waivers for the Pressler Amendment. This was a congressional action that had required the administration to cut off all economic and security funding for any country pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And of course, Pakistan had publicly announced they were developing a nuclear weapon to counter India, which was doing the same thing. So as the Pakistanis would have it, they went from being the most allied of allies in the anti-Soviet jihad to being the most sanctioned of adversaries when that jihad succeeded in its aim. So you fast forward to 9/11, boom, we're back. We're back in Pakistan. We are starting up our assistance and cooperation again. The leadership narrative went something like this. Well, we're glad you're back. We're glad you're back with your money and your weapon systems. We're going to take while the taking is good. We'll join you in the fight against Al-Qaeda. But if you're completely wrong if you think we're going to turn the Afghan Taliban into a mortal enemy, because we know what you're going to do. You did it before. What you're going to do is at a certain point, you're going to decide you're tired of it all. It's not what you intended. You got other things to worry about, and you're going to be gone again. Now, that prophecy turned out, sadly, to be all too true, vindicating, at least in their own minds, their position that that it would have been suicidal to make an enemy out of the Taliban that is now running Afghanistan. So I can imagine that by mid-August of this year, that the high fives were being exchanged around the corridors of power in Islamabad and Rawalpindi, but it didn't last very long. And here's the really dangerous thing we've done. I alluded to this earlier, that by, again, organizing our withdrawal in a way that gave the country back to the Taliban, and with the return of Al-Qaeda as well, we have energized radical Islamic movements all across the world. And there are some very dangerous ones in Pakistan. You mentioned the Haqqanis. Well, we're going to see what the Haqqanis do now. Are they just going to say thank you very much to the government in Islamabad and they're back across the border in their own country? Or are they going to keep a presence in Pakistan? So watch that space. It's conceivably going to be very important. Even more important, I think, is the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistani Taliban doesn't aim at Afghanistan, it aims at Pakistan. Its mission is to bring down the government in Islamabad and take over that country as the Taliban have done in Afghanistan. And of course, the success of the Taliban in Afghanistan has absolutely energized these guys. And the Pakistanis are, as they should be, very worried about it. The same thing with the Kashmiri militants like Lashkar-e-Taiba. These were in fact created by Pakistan after partition to try to get the Kashmir back from India. But the Pakistanis have lost control of those movements, and they too now are very energized. So it's not that we have a Pakistan problem. It is thanks to us, Pakistan has a huge Islamic militant problem of its own. Why does this matter? It's a country of 220 million people with nuclear weapons. So again, by taking the lid off this Aladdin's lamp and allowing the Taliban to spin a narrative of success against the United States on the field of battle, the region has gotten way more dangerous than it already was.
Mr. Ambassador, if I could switch gears, maybe to look, switch flanks, as it were, to look at Iran. Your assessment of what's Iran policy going to be vis-a-vis Afghanistan? How has is there ways in which Iran is emboldened by events in Afghanistan? And then if I could maybe cheat outside the parameters of our conversation so far, is that any assessment you might share with the prospects for the JCPOA resurrection? Anything you'd have to share, given your decades-long experience working with and against the Iranians, would be most helpful.
Well, as I suggested before, the Iranians were more than ready to engage with us through the Geneva process after 9/11, because we had a common enemy, and that enemy was the Taliban. Now, since then, the Iranians, and they're very good at this, they've hedged all kinds of bets too, actually providing support for the Taliban when it became clear that we were in retreat mode, building up connections and relationships as much as they could. But the intrinsic reality is still there. There is not enough room in the region for the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan and the Islamic Republic of Iran to coexist peacefully together, and they do share a very long border. And it gets into the essence of Islam itself. The Islamic Emirate, of course, is Sunni. The Islamic Republic is Shia. Those two countries almost went to war in the late 1990s. So again, it's a brief moment of high-fiving. Anything that's bad for the great Satan has got to be good in Iran. But they know the dynamic. The Taliban are not their friends. They're not even neutrals. They're going to have a lot on their plate for quite a while inside Iran, inside Afghanistan, as they try to get organized. But the reality is, Iran's got to be pretty worried too, that the Taliban will reach across into disaffected Sunni communities inside Iran, such as Baluchistan, which has always been unstable, and that Iran has a new source of threat to them that will once again emanate from Afghanistan. Now, we should not be encouraged by this at all, because it's not about something that just weakens the Islamic Republic. It adds another ratio of instability to a region that already has too much. What does that mean for the JCPOA? My guess is that nothing is going to happen too fast. I think we're going to see both the United States and its allies that are part of the JCPOA process, and Iran itself, trying to see how this is going to settle in Afghanistan, what shape and directions are going to emerge out of the chaos that we've seen over the last month, before they take any more major strategic steps, either to resuscitate the JCPOA or to put an end to it. So I think that's just going to stay frozen for a while as everybody takes a look at this new unpleasant reality that we have engendered.
Mr. Ambassador, in your work with Afghanistan and Iraq, you've always worked closely with our European NATO allies. Are there any, looking forward, what are the implications or the fallout, if you will, from our pullout from Afghanistan and how that was conducted for working with and by and through our European NATO allies?
Well, this is a case where President Biden sadly out-trumped President Trump. You may recall our NATO allies were pretty upset and visibly and vocally upset over President Trump's decision to half our already small force from 5,000 to 2,500 without any consultations whatsoever with NATO capitals. President Biden kind of ran on that to say, I will bring America's international role back to the fore. We will lead in the world. We will consult with our allies, and we will move forward together in areas where we have common interest. And then did just the opposite, of course, in Afghanistan. Again, as everyone in this room knows, the mission, the NATO mission in Afghanistan was one that was very popular for NATO countries, of giving relevance to the alliance past the Soviet Union and the Cold War. We didn't have the preponderance of troops in Afghanistan. NATO added together had as much or more on the ground than we did. And then again, we went a major step beyond President Trump in saying, this is everybody's going out, and all that implied, so that we saw NATO countries having to scramble to get their own folks out in a little bit of time that was a lot given to them. So again, it's hard to imagine a step that could have had more negative impacts on our vital national security interests than the steps that President Biden took and set in motion. He is looking more reckless and more unilateral than even President Trump. And let's face it, that's a pretty tall order. But he has managed it, not only taking actions with a very negative strategic consequence that he seemed not even to think about, but also effectively to do it on his own without talking again to anyone. And as I look forward, we have put our Western alliances, primarily NATO, in grave jeopardy by behaving unilaterally on a matter of real strategic consequence.
Mr. Ambassador, I appreciate your candid and no nonsense assessments. Let me see if I can push you a little bit into a different direction. Talk about Russia and China. I mean, you over the years, I mean, you've got decades of experience working on the region. How have you seen the Russian and Chinese diplomacy and security ties in the region changed? For better or for worse from American interests? What's your assessment in the aftermath of Afghanistan of China and Russia, particularly as this conference is looking at great power competitions?
The Russia and China are very, very different entities today, with very different goals, and most significantly with very different means toward those goals. The Russia of President Putin resembles in a lot of important respects the Soviet Union. The most important of those areas of similarity is money. The Soviets ran out of it, and so have the Russians. So there's a lot of speculation in Syria, for example, that the success, if you will, of Russian engagement and policy in Syria, they kept their guy, Bashar al-Assad, in power when we wanted to knock him off, was going to translate into a much more robust role in the region, a la the Soviet Union. Somehow Russia would again return to the Cold War as an adversary of equal strength to the United States. Well, that's not going to happen. I think the whole world got to see, for example, their sole aircraft carrier, after making this historic passage through the Dardanelles, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, and then break down in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, you know, they're out of Schlitz there in the Russian Empire. It's why when Putin started making noises about engaging militarily in support of the Venezuelan government, my reaction was, guys, great idea. You know, don't send battalions, send brigades. Hey, make it a division. Bring in your aircraft carrier if it'll float that. You know, their enemy isn't us. Their enemy is their own bankruptcy. Now, China, a different matter. Obviously, they have their Belt and Road Initiative, striving to build influence and maintain it wherever they can. They've long been engaged in Africa in such efforts. But, you know, when you look at South Asia, Pakistan and Afghanistan, for example, it's a case generally where we would want them to do more than they're ready to do, not less. And they got that copper concession some years ago in Afghanistan. And part of the deal was that they would build a road and rail network, not only to get the copper out, but also simply to improve communications in Afghanistan as a whole. They didn't do it. And we have pinged them on it. Similarly in Pakistan, where they've been involved in the development of a major port at Gwadar on the Pakistani coast. There again, and I was kind of part of this. They had undertaken that they would build supportive infrastructure, rail links and road links that would connect Gwadar to the rest of the country, and at the same time connect the government of Pakistan to that strategic but very isolated area in the southwest. They didn't do that either. And this is a delicious irony that most haven't realized. The overall Gwadar port consultancy is in the hands of American firms, has been from the start. That we play a major role in who gets what contracts, and we favored the Chinese because we thought they had the capacity to get the job done, and in the process also improve the means of communication for the Pakistani government in their own territory. So in this particular part of the U.S.-Chinese relationship, we're in this odd position where we're not trying to block them. We've been trying to encourage them to step forward in mutually beneficial ways. We'll see what they do now. I don't have a clue. But I would add, Rick, you asked about the JCPOA. Yeah. Here is something that President Biden could do to counter the narrative that the U.S. is returning to isolationism, and that would be to figure out a way back into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Of all the strategic missteps that we saw during the Trump administration, that may have been the most costly, not the JCPOA, although that was costly enough. It was pulling out of the organization that had specifically been designed to be a counterweight to the Chinese. So let's see if the Biden administration is going to take a step like that as a means of reaffirming that the U.S. is not in full retreat globally, which is the signal Afghanistan sent, but ready to step forward strategically with allies to counter a Chinese drive for expanded influence.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm very cognizant of your time constraints and where our session is coming to an end. But I do want to, we've talked about Afghanistan, since 9/11, we've talked about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We've talked about the neighboring states, Pakistan and Iran, and NATO allies in Russia and China. If I could try to actually step out and ask more broader, sort of pick your brains on broader wisdom that we can nurture going forward past the in great power competition and past 9/11, is to talk about U.S. diplomacy writ large. Secretary of State talks about, leading with diplomacy. And yet those of us in and around government long enough have long been frustrated that the Department of State is grossly underfunded and undermanned and can't possibly be expected to compete, person per person with the Department of Defense and the uniformed services, armed services. But what do we need to do to have a re-energized American diplomatic capacity, which is fundamental to American power in the globe? Can you give us a sense on what we need to do for the Foreign Service, for our personnel, for our funding, for the integration into the Interagency National Security Council process? What would be your recommendations for this administration and administrations going forward?
It's really the same need that Russia has, money. We may be slightly better positioned to actually get it. The strongest supporters of the Foreign Service are in DOD. Those senior officers who have served with us in the crunchy places of the world, like Afghanistan and Iraq, and many of them have been pretty outspoken about it. General Mattis's last testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee as CENTCOM commander had that line in it of, the Senate had better fully fund the State Department budget request. Otherwise, I'm going to have to buy a whole lot more bullets. And that it made for great TV, but it is also his deeply held conviction. And I've heard Secretary Austin say the same thing before he was Secretary Austin. So it's those who have been with us that do understand the value added that an effectively resourced and trained diplomatic service is a huge strategic consequence to DOD and the uniformed services. The more of us, the less of them. We are at a moment, I think, when because of a chain of events over the last few years, the Foreign Service is in one of those rare periods where Hill attention, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, are focused on the what diplomacy can do and what development can do that we just have not really had before. So it's time again for an internationalist administration to step forward, seize the moment, put forward budget requests that are far larger than they have been in the past, along with a rationale for why we need those kinds of resources. But again, unfortunately, the way Afghanistan played out, nobody's going to be looking at the State Department budget again, I think, anytime real soon. But we do still need to try to, seize the moment and get those resources locked in, and as locked in as they can possibly be for the out years. And that's hard in our budget process. But we've just got to pay more attention and devote more resources to the other two Ds, diplomacy and development. Indeed, in the latter part of my 2 years in Iraq as ambassador, as violence just dropped to almost zero, and there were tremendous opportunities for effective economic assistance, DOD having those CERT funds, but they're not development officers. They knew who were USAID. General Odierno wanted way more USAID officers than I could possibly give him. He would have liked to have at that period, had them all the way down to certainly to the brigade level, but even in certain sectors down to the battalion level. And I just couldn't, they weren't there. I mean, I just could not give him officers that did not exist. So again, I am hopeful toward the success of an effort to seize this moment and turn it into real and sustainable support for the diplomacy and development aspects of our Triple D triad.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, our time has come to an end, but I do want to thank you for sharing both your time and your expertise and experience with us. I'm struck that academics like me read histories made by diplomats such as yourself. You make the history, we read the history. And I'm sure our viewing audience can now see, if they didn't know before, but they now can see and understand why you're considered one of the most gifted diplomats of a generation. So thank you so much for spending your time with us. And thank you, the viewing audience, for getting perspective on 9/11, events since, and looking forward in the great power competition. And it's, I think at this point, I'll turn the floor over to Dr. Ron Sanders to continue with the program. Thank you all very much.
But just before you do that, Rick,
Sure.
We're into the bonus round at no additional cost. Academics not only read history, of course, they write it. And that can have a huge impact on practitioners as well as other academics. And when one looks at the title of this conference, Great Power Competition, and I realize this is the fourth year?
Fourth session.
Well, it is very aptly named because the era we've been in since 1945 was not the era of great power competition. It was the era of U.S. global leadership. Yes, of course, we had the Cold War, the Soviet mutually assured destruction. We remember all that. Yet it was the era of American leadership. Now, great power competition, that phrase, another way to phrase it, meaning pretty much the same thing, would be balance of power.
Yeah.
That if you don't have a single country in a leadership role globally, you default basically to a balance of power system. And there may be variations according to region, how that is put together and how it works, but that's what it is. So what's wrong with that? Well, try 2 world wars and the Holocaust, because it was the balance of power system, or the imbalance of power system. Of course, it produced World War I and World War I itself, because the US moved off stage under President Wilson, unfortunately, and not through President Wilson's doing. That Versailles Agreement, of course, had the seeds of World War II. So before the last century was halfway done, you had these 2 world wars and the unspeakability of the Holocaust. That's what's wrong with the great power system. That is what's wrong with the balance of power system. I used the phrase hinge of history before. This is another aspect of that hinge. What are we going to have? Return to balance of power or a reaffirmation of US global leadership? The 50 years in the first half of the 20th century versus the 50 years of the latter half of the 20th century, I think, tell the story. Well, let's not have this century retell the story of the first half of the last century.
I might make a comment to bring it back, if I could, Mr. Ambassador. It would be the balance of power isn't broken in of itself. The balance of power requires a Bismarck or Metternich, as Kissinger would have written, to sophisticatedly manage the balance of power. And when you get mishaps, it's because you don't have accomplished diplomats and statespersons such as yourself trying to manage, cope with that competition of power among roughly equally powerful entities. We can have that debate and discussion in another course or class. But thank you for bringing political realism into the conversation. That is actually flown by, dropped out of the lexicon of American diplomats. Interesting enough, particularly those who serve in Europe. not those that work in the Middle East, NEE Bureau.
I will refrain from comment.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, it was a great pleasure to see you and to speak with you today. Thank you so much for your time and service, and best of luck with, with the other demands on your schedule and time. Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.